Imagine yourself ascending a mountain where the temperature is around 5 degrees and getting colder by the minute. The air is oxygen poor and difficult to breathe, and the sun is literally blinding you. You know that you have voluntarily paid tens of thousands of dollars for this, and you have been saving for years to buy pricey gear and one of the best guides in the world, but it doesn't matter anymore because you are going to climb Everest. As you can see, there is a green boot protruding from the snow not far from you. This indicates that you are now at a height of 12,000 meters, meaning that there is only about 350 meters left. By the way, those boots belong to a desperate man who died while attempting to do what you were doing. In recent years, the mountain has killed over 300 climbers, and in 2023, climbing Everest became somewhat of a curse. The record for the number of fatalities was broken in the first half of the year alone. And the worst part is that the remains of about 200 people remain on the slopes. Unspoken rule in the mountains. No one is to be saved in any case. But is it really required to follow it? Yes, climbing Everest is a luxury, but no matter how much you spend, nobody can ensure that you'll return alive or that at least your corpse will return. If you look through different websites that offer advice on how to reach the summit of Mount Everest, the costs will shock you. The equipment is also expensive. You'll need a special warm suit, tracker's goggles, and even an oxygen tank because you'll have trouble breathing at 7,000 meters. To put it succinctly, nobody is certain who owns the green boots, but his body became a notorious landmark on the northern route of Everest. Some believe it is Sung Palar, who was a member of the Indian team wearing the green boots made by the well-known Clack Company, which manufactures shoes especially for climbers. Others think it might be DJ Morup, who also vanished on Everest. David Sharp's. The rescue operation at such heights is a very controversial issue which is only proved by David Sharp's example. David's lifelong interest for mountain climbing began when he ascended Rosebery, the top of a hill in North Yorkshire, when he was a little boy. His larger accomplishments included climbing the highest peaks in Africa and Europe, including Kilimanjaro, Elbrus, and Chu, one of the highest Himalayan mountains. David attempted to climb Everest for the first time in 2003 as part of an expedition, but he was unable to reach the summit. Despite his extreme endurance, the alpinist helped a tired Spanish climber who was just beginning his ascent, despite suffering from severe frostbite and losing several fingers. Sharp shared some extra oxygen with him. A year later, the climber repeated his attempt, but he didn't have the strength to go through the last 350 meters to the top. The fact that David chose not to use an oxygen tank was a significant factor because climbers enjoy setting records. And climbing the highest mountain in the world without oxygen is arguably the riskiest of all. With the same mindset, Sharp performed his third trick. Although David's mother was somewhat concerned about her son, he repeatedly reassured her that climbing Everest wasn't as risky as people claimed because there would always be other climbers in the area, and you wouldn't be alone on the trail. Several climbing groups reported seeing a fatigued Sharp at various points along the route as he was descending, but no one knew if Sharp had reached his goal, or if he had chosen to turn back before reaching the top. David began his journey to the top from the base camp on May 13, 2006. Despite numerous people's advice to bring oxygen tanks with him, Sharp sat with his arms over his knees as if he wasn't feeling well, but no one stayed with him to help him down. A day later, Sharp was discovered in a limestone cave where the owner of the green boots lies frozen to death. Sharp's words to his mother weren't really true. He was just trying to reassure her that climbing the world's highest mountain is a dangerous activity for any human body, and that you should not expect someone to share oxygen with you like David did with the Spanish climber. He was sitting by himself, gradually losing consciousness from the intolerable cult. In the end, it is only your business that you chose to take such a risk. Other climbers have also paid a lot of money to experience the same rush of adrenaline and endure the journey. When the next group of alpinists spotted David, Maxim Chia was one of them who chose to sit down and speak to Sharp. However, as soon as Maxim tried to look into David's eyes, he noticed that his face had already turned black. The group members were terrified and started to come up with a plan to help, but the other climbers told them to keep going and not risk their lives. He had tried so hard to cope on his own, but now he needed help. Eventually, another climber found him, gave him medicine and oxygen, and then moved on. David's death sparked a series of media controversies that raised the question of whether to take risks to help other climbers in need in the harsh mountain environment after more than 40 people noticed his serious condition. The only thing they could do without hurting themselves was to send a radio message to the base camp, but because of the extreme weather, it was impossible to get help. As a result, David died alone among the cold slopes of Everest. Their indifference makes you further lose hope in humanity. Does this imply that everyone saves themselves in the mountains? For example, climbers on other Himalayan mountains would never do that, in his opinion, because modern commercial guides only care about their clients' obsession with reaching the summit at any cost, even if it means losing one of their teammates. And in an interview with journalists from the British Weekly Sunday Times, Sharp's mother, Linda Sharp, said that you have a responsibility to save yourself, not to try to save someone else. However, what if you go mountain climbing not alone, not in a group but, for example, with a loved one? Francis Yarbo Distano. Francis Yarbo Distano lived in the charming town of Telluride, Colorado, which was frequented by many athletic, attractive climbers from over the world, including Serge Aron, who earned the nickname Snow Leopard for having climbed all 5 of the former Soviet Union's peaks. She immediately captivated Francis, and the two became married. Francis shared the mountaineer's passion, and the two of them worked to conquer the mountains one small step at a time. Her unwavering perseverance earned her a reputation as the first American woman to ski down Elis, and the couple then set the historic goal of conquering Everest, so that Francis would become the first American woman to climb the world's highest peak. Additionally, the couple chose to do it without the use of oxygen or guidance support at the time. Francis and Serge had an 11-year-old son, and the plan of his parents frightened him. The boy even had a nightmare in which 2 climbers were trapped on a mountain that had been destroyed by a storm and were unable to escape the snow, which knocked them down. The boy told his mother about the dream in an attempt to convince her not to go to Everest, but Francis was adamant, and she was not going to cancel the Everest climb. On May 17, 1998, Francis and Serge started their ascent from the base camp and arrived at the North Col. The following day, they achieved an amazing height of 7,700 meters, and on May 19th, they made the decision to ascend to the final camp before the summit, which is at 8,290 meters. On May 20th, they were supposed to make the last push to the top of Everest, but their flashlights suddenly broke, leaving them in total darkness. On May 21st, they attempted to resume their ascent, but Francis and Serge were already exhausted and realized their energy reserves were gradually running out. They decided not to risk their lives any longer and went back to camp. Before the final push on May 22nd, they moved up again. Still, this descent was painfully slow, each because Francis and Serge were far away. It was already getting dark, and step was being unbelievably difficult. Francis and Serge had been at an elevation of over 8,000 meters for several days. This is the most hazardous area of Everest, known as the death zone. Climbers typically calculate the deadline so they do not have to turn back in the dark. This section of the mountain got its name because of the severe oxygen shortage, which causes the human body to fight for survival. The climbers then regretted not bringing their oxygen tanks and started planning an escape, but for some reason they decided to part ways, and Serge went back to camp. When Ian Woodhall and his beloved Kathy Odo discovered that Francis had not yet arrived, he set out again the following morning with the necessary supplies of oxygen and medication. At that time, they were only 350 meters from the summit of Mount Everest when they noticed a body in the snow. It was a half-conscious Francis who was near death from oxygen deprivation and frostbite. The woman was only wearing a thermal suit, and the rest of her clothing was strewn all over the place. The problem is that as frostbite reaches its latter stages, you start to feel so feverish and desperate that you might just take everything off. At that point, the couple knew their adventure, which they had been planning for years in hopes of finding sponsors, was gone. Ian took the victim's hair out of her face and saw that her plan for Everest had been in the press, so he knew right once whose fate was in their hands. Kathy started to hold the frozen body to her to keep it warm, while Ian attempted to dress her, but Francis's muscles had weakened. Her arms and legs just would not flex, making her resemble a fabric doll. After 2 hours of Francis muttering, "I am an American. Please do not leave me," to get her dressed, Ian attempted to pick her up and carry her, but it was pointless because it was like trying to run underwater in the high snow. The man realized that this venture was becoming dangerous for them, especially for his partner Kathy, and the couple decided to return to the camp for assistance. They took one last look at Francis, who looked like a real sleeping beauty, and tried to call everyone he could, but was unsuccessful because of the poor weather. The sergeant who went to the rescue, his spouse vanished, In the snow, the climbers discovered Isaac without a trace, and a year later they discovered the climber's body. It appears that S.J. perished after falling from a height while looking for his wife. Ian remembers that he could not go a day without thinking about Francys. A year later, he and Kathy tried again to reach the summit and were successful, but they were appalled to see the climber's body again on the way back. She lay exactly as the couple had left her, and Ian and Kathy made a commitment to go back to Everest once more to bury Francys. It took them 8 years and all of their savings to prepare for this expedition, and on March 20th, 2007, they arrived at the woman's body once more, wrapped it in an American flag, and tucked a note from her son inside. They then pushed her body into the cliff out of sight of the other climbers who had been taking pictures of her for years, as if she were an exhibit. Scott Fischer. He founded the iconic travel company Mountain Madness and helped other climbers achieve the same success as he did in 1996. As part of his company's services, Scott organized the most serious expedition of all the Everest climb. At the same time, the company Adventure Consultants, owned by a New Zealand resident Rob Hall, also applied to climb the mountain. Thus, the competition between the two organizations and their guides began who would reach the desired summit first. However, everything didn't go exactly according to Fischer's plan. In the end, the team reached the summit of Everest at nearly 4 p.m. on May 10th, which is nearly 2 hours later than the strict deadline for a safe descent. Rob Hall's group also arrived at the summit well after the deadline. By that time, Scott encountered several difficulties during the ascent, including some members of his group becoming ill and weak, so he assisted them in returning to the camps and climbed back up. Fischer was incredibly exhausted, feeling ill, and probably suffering from altitude sickness, which happens when the body's tissues and organs do not get enough oxygen because, as you would expect, atmospheric pressure drops at high elevations. Scott, like many other professional climbers, did not want to use more oxygen in this state. If you do not descend quickly, you risk developing pulmonary or brain edema, which in severe cases almost always results in death. In this state, a person experiences headaches, dizziness, confusion, and weakness, so they need rest and assistance. However, as a responsible guide, Scott could not afford to let that happen. He had to return his group safely, but things were only going to get worse. Shortly after the two teams started to descend, a strong snowstorm struck the mountain, preventing the climbers from reaching the closest shelter. Since they needed to act fast and the weather was getting worse, Fischer, who was already having trouble, told his assistants to save the team and head down to camp without him. His teammates were able to save a number of their group members who could not handle the blizzard. Even one member of the rival camp, but by the time the climbers returned for Fischer, he was already dead. His body was moved off the main route and is still on the mountain today. Does this imply that some guides are not scared to risk their lives? This blizzard was one of the deadliest in Everest history because it claimed the lives of 8 people in addition to Fischer. Rob Hall. What was happening with the group that Rob Hall was leading as they ascended the mountain? Rob was also a reasonably well-known climber. In 1980, he became the second person to ascend the northern ridge of Ahmad to Blam, and in 1981, he became the first person to ascend Mount Nober. He envisioned conquering the highest peaks on each of the 7 continents, but Rob's ambition drove him to go beyond his comfort zone. Rob and his colleague Gary Ball were particularly drawn to the 7 Summits concept, which began as a climbing challenge in 1985. He aimed to complete this task in a short amount of time, 7 months, devoting 1 month to each peak. He and Gary's journey started with Everest, which is regarded as the most difficult climb on the list, and they succeeded in climbing all 7 of them. This accomplishment set a record for the speed at which mountain climbing was accomplished at the time, which is why clients paid his company Adventure Consultants $65,000 to be their guides during the 1996 ascent of Mount Everest. Everything went smoothly until the very last few hours before the summit, when one of his clients, Beck Weathers, struggled to cope because he was blinded by the snow. Beck Weathers did not even realize that he should not be upset about it. In fact, he was extremely lucky that day, but Hall had to make the difficult decision to leave the climber to wait at camp for their return in order to ensure weather safety. This is typically caused by sunlight reflecting off snow or ice. Another client had a similar experience that day. As the climbing time went on, Doug Hansen began to show signs of exhaustion. Paul realized they would not reach the summit in time, but he persisted in climbing so they would not lose the competition with the group led by Scott Fischer. As a result, Paul's team arrived at the top with a significant delay, which did not satisfy Doug Hansen. Hansen failed to make it. There was nearly no visibility and 240 km of wind during the blizzard. Almost immediately after the tragedy, the debate over the commercialization of Everest resurfaced in numerous newspaper and magazine articles. One of Hall's fellow guides attempted to save Rob by bringing extra oxygen and water, but the oxygen mask's regulator could not withstand the low temperatures, and it was no longer able to supply air. Eventually, he managed to call his wife via satellite phone from the base camp and send a message that said, "Sleep well, my love. Please do not worry too much. George Mallory." He intended to ascend the mountain and become the first person to do so. George made his first ascent of Everest slopes in 1921 as a member of a British expedition whose objective was to first identify the most accessible route to the summit, which had never been reached before. Mallory resolved to complete the task in 1924 at the age of 37, because he was terrified that if he continued to consider it, he would be too old to summit Everest. A year later, an avalanche prevented him from reaching the mountain's highest point. He and his team started the ascent at the end of May, but not all of the participants were ready for the severe weather on Everest. Some climbers became fatigued easily, while others were ill all the time, which slowed down the process because they did not want to wait for the other competitors to recover. Mallory and his companion Andrew Irvine set out for the summit alone on June 6. According to George, Andrew was adamant about reaching the summit of Everest with the other climbers. On June 8, they were spotted at a distance of roughly 244 meters from the summit. Soon after, George and Andrew just disappeared, leaving a mystery that no one could ever fully unravel for 75 years, until the first hint at their whereabouts was revealed by a British expedition in 1933 called Mountaineer-Peary-Wynne. Near the summit, Harris found an ice axe that was thought to have belonged to the missing climbers. Upon closer inspection, they noticed some hand-carved marks on the axe that resembled a cross. Irvine's friends claimed that their friend used to mark his belongings in a similar manner. But when Peary went to see these clues, Harris, who also climbed Everest, assured them that his guide, a Sherpa, had made the carved cross. As you can see, Kusing failed in his mission and confused people trying to find the climbers' bodies. Therefore, he tagged the ISA to prevent it from being misplaced or mistaken with others. 3 years later, during a British expedition to Mount Everest, alpinist Frank Smith allegedly used a powerful telescope to identify the possible bodies of Mallory and Irvine. However, he never reached them, and in 1975, climber Wang Hongbo claimed discovered the remains of someone on Everest. This sparked a series of search expeditions that were specifically focused on finding Irvine and George, so people focused their energies not on climbing the peak, but on finding corpses that no one had hoped to find for a long time. Conrad Anker, an American climber, saw a big flat rock on the region's northern slopes on May 1, 1999. It did not take him long to understand it was George Mallory, not a rock. Mallory's clothing had been ruined by time, but the mountain environment had kept the majority of his body intact, and the axe was a few meters away, right above Mallory's body. The crew delineated the search region where the bodies were anticipated to be found based on Wang Hongbi's testimony and hints from earlier trips. This suggested that he died as a result of a bad fall. Unfortunately, Irvine's body was never found, but it is quite possible that he suffered a similar fate. Just think about it, Mallory's body was found 75 years later. No one will ever know whether he and Irvine managed to reach the top of Mount Everest. It turns out that they lost their lives in vain, because their feat will remain a mystery no one will ever solve. I think you've already understood what I'm getting at here. If you also decide to take a chance, you must know you may suffer the same fate. After all, you can't really expect to be rescued by other climbers, and your body might be found many years later when your loved ones might not be alive. There is hope that you won't be the last. Now imagine you are a member of the G team and have been saving for your dream of conquering Everest all of your life. How would you react to this? Write in the comments.